G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Our Future Our Way, the Healing Foundation's webinar on talking intergenerational trauma. Thanks very much for being with us, whether you're here in person in Canberra or watching online around Australia. Don't forget you can submit your questions to our panel by pursuing the hashtag, which I always get wrong, Talk Trauma, or through the live chat facility if you're watching online. My name's Richard Frankland, I'm a Gundi Jamara fella. And my involvement with transgenerational trauma, it's a bit like every black fella in the country, touched by the stolen generation, touched by the invasion we know, or colonisation, whatever word you want to use. We know that it's a structure, not an event. It's not something that we get over in just 220 plus years. I'd like to pay respect to the traditional owners of this country, and we'll be having a special welcome to country very shortly. A bit of a lip malfunction there. Transgenerational trauma comes about when people have been colonised or invaded. It comes about with such horrific traumatic events impact on our great-grandparents, our grandparents, our parents, and finally us. Last time I did this webinar, or this type of webinar for the Healing Foundation, there was a tremendous woman here who was the fourth person in a row in her family who'd been stolen. And with great courage and tenacity, she came home. She's very representative of our people, an amazing buoyancy to be able to bounce back from this trauma, the trauma that we all face. In particular, today we're going to talk about our young people. Our young people are carrying massive cultural loads. They're carrying the cultural load of reclaiming culture and law. They're carrying the cultural load of discrimination, of trying to find a way to navigate the pathway through the dominant culture, to be more than just victims, more than just survivors, but to be achievers and contributors, and to help us rally to the flag. Our children today are taken away in some states at a rate that surpasses the stolen generation era. It's more likely for a young Aboriginal and Islander man to be incarcerated than to go to university. These type of statistics, we often cry out to the dominant culture, to the authorities, and often we feel like we're not heard. Today, thanks to the Healing Foundation, we're going to be heard all across the nation. This morning, our panel of Indigenous leaders, Professor Lisa Jackson Pulver, Rosemary Wanganeen and Mark Munnich, will be discussing some of the factors that contribute to the intergenerational trauma and how we can prevent and how we can address that trauma. But before I introduce our first speaker, it's my great pleasure to introduce Shane Mortimer. Shane is also a Gumal Ngambri man, and he's a descendant of the Gumal Nation, the Ngambri people. He's lived in Canberra since the beginning of time, and the word Canberra actually derives from his mob, the name, his Gumal clan group. He's here to make us all feel welcome and to welcome us to his traditional land and country. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please put your hands together.
Thank you, Richard.
Real honour, thank you.
Lovely. It's my honour to be here. Kai bulan maranya, kaga gumal dewara ngamri mitang. So it's just hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to Gumal Nation, Ngambri country. A very great privilege to be here. I'd like to just commence this with a little ceremony that we perform on these sort of occasions when people come from backgrounds that are dissimilar, from distances away, just to unite us all as one. It's a small ochre ceremony. It's done by casting the ochre so that the ochre rises and then drifts and then falls. It's our way of paying respect to the earth from which we come, the earth that provides our sustenance, and the earth to which we return. It also pays respects to our ancestors and our elders past and present. But more importantly, it unites us all as one. Because as the ochre rises, then drifts, then falls, so too do our differences. And we're united as one. I look at the subject today, our future, our way, and I'm very proud to be an allodial person of this land. Our future, our way, is part of our very being and our belonging as allodial people. Allodial is our entitlement to land. It's the entitlement of all First Peoples nations across the world. Our entitlement within country to everything below the ground to the core of the earth and everything above the earth to the stars. And that is our entitlement. It's a title that cannot be extinguished. It can't be taken away. The only way that we can deal with that title, if we want to, if we choose to, is we can trade it off. We could sell it. We could bequeath it. But there must be a trace of that title having been passed from one group to another. It's a title acknowledged worldwide and very important to our people. In my professional life as a counsellor, in my professional counselling practice, I find that connection to country is absolutely essential to the well-being of our people. You know, that connection, that feeling of place and feeling of being is all part of that soil that we are from, that we are connected to. And extremely efficacious in knowing that. I've treated so many people through my counselling practice where once they realise their connection to country and I take them back to that country, it makes them a completely different person. Quite a remarkable thing that is achieved through that connection to country and our allodial place. Nobody, not even the Crown, has our title. Our allodial title, allodial means without lords, nobody to lord it over your title. Not even the British Crown. They have what's called radical title, which in an international court is burdened by our allodial title. Very, very important. When we look at here, talking intergenerational trauma, Traum is German origins, means dream. And everybody knows that dream is very important to our people. Our dreaming is part of the fabric of our being. And as a counsellor, obviously, I've done quite a bit of study in psychology. And I look at the intergenerational nature of trauma, that intergenerational dream, which Freud wrote about, and he called it phylogenius. Phylogenius. So this dreaming was intergenerational dreaming. And this is what happens to us. I, in saying that, pay my deepest respect to the stolen generation people on this day. And my family are part of that. For now 9 generations in a consecutive line of mitochondrial DNA, our connection in this land to Canberra. And about 5 generations ago, when my great-great-grandmother was taken, dumped on the Brungle mission, and then her children taken from her, I relate to you. I relate to you. It's been that intergenerational trauma, that phylogenius, that has impacted on my people and why I'm standing before you here today. But in saying that, out of all of that adversity, we have opportunity, and we have an opportunity to get it right. And with that, I welcome you to country. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That's a tremendous welcome to country and makes me feel very welcome, and I'm sure all of us. Thank you again. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of my lookalikes. I'm sure he grew a beard just to look like me, Richard Weston. His name wasn't always Richard, he changed it to look like me again. He's a descendant of the Miriam people of the Torres Strait. He's worked in Indigenous affairs for more than 20 years, and 14 of those in Indigenous-controlled health services in far west New South Wales and Queensland. That's a tremendous qualification, being on the front line for that long. Since September 2010, he's led the Healing Foundation's work in supporting culturally strong, community-led healing projects that help Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people heal from trauma and reconnect with our culture. Now, just for those of you who don't know, the Healing Foundation has a national focus. It supports our mob all over and really is the spear point, is a tremendous spear point in taking our voice right from the grassroots to the absolute highest levels. And the bloke leading that, I'm very, very proud to introduce. He does owe me some money, so that's why I'm talking like this. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Richard Weston, if you please.
Thank you, Richard, I think. Look, I'm really pleased to be here, and the Healing Foundation is really proud to be hosting this webinar today. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this country, and thank you, Shane, for that warm and insightful welcome. And to all those people that are watching us online, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that you're on today, wherever you may be. And I'd also like to acknowledge our fantastic panel, Lisa, Mark and Rosemary, and of course young Richard here. It's very timely to have these knowledge holders in the room today sharing their personal and professional experiences of the intergenerational trauma that's affecting our young people. Today is the national day that we celebrate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Forcibly removing children from their families, communities and culture under the Stolen Generations policies resulted in harm, trauma and a cycle of negative outcomes for our peoples. Trauma has been passed down to our young people, weakening their spirits and harming their development, choices and opportunities. Unfortunately, these experiences are not isolated amongst our people. The most recent National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander survey found 8% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aged 15 years and over had been removed from their families, and a staggering 38% of people had relatives who had been removed. As well as dealing with their own trauma, many Indigenous young people also care for parents, grandparents and other family members still impacted by policies like Stolen Generations, a further burden that is often not recognised. We welcome the recent public attention and investigation into juvenile detention in the NT and the Prime Minister's quick action to establish a Royal Commission. It is distressing to witness young people already affected by intergenerational trauma being further traumatised by a youth justice system that does little to curb youth offending. The lack of rehabilitation and healing in the system we saw in Four Corners is not best practice. In fact, it is the exact opposite. It is bad practice and deeply damaging to the spirits of our young people. We understand the need for our people to have greater engagement and voice in policy development, in Indigenous affairs. This is part of healing. The Healing Foundation is an organisation that works closely with our community, commits to working with the Minister and the staff of PM&C in this engagement. Urgent action is needed to address the reasons our young people are ending up in detention in the first place, while being mindful that this cycle has occurred over the long term and lasted many generations. Before I hand over to our panel of Indigenous leaders to discuss some of the solutions to these issues, I would like to finish by saying no one knows more about these challenges than Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and no one is better placed to address them. Healing Foundation programs show time and time again that when you work in partnership with communities to address local issues, the results can be extraordinary. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. And it's very timely that we are having this webinar to talk about intergenerational trauma on this day, National Aboriginal Children's Day, and with the event that happened a couple of weeks ago that was brought to us by Four Corners. We all live with that trauma, and I travel a bit, and everywhere I've gone, Aboriginal and Islander people and non-Aboriginal people have been absolutely horrified about what was disclosed. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a friend of mine. We worked together some 25 years ago on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and I've observed Rosemary's work in trauma over the last 25 years. Rosemary is a proud Kaurna woman from the Adelaide Plains, Kulgatha Wirangu, from the west coast of South Australia. Her childhood and adolescence was punctuated with abuse and racism stemming from the stolen generations. After undertaking her own healing journey, she founded the sacred site within Healing Centre in 1993 and the Australian Institute for Loss and Grief in 2005. Absolutely commendable. Rosemary continues to devote her life into healing, loss and grief as a clinical practitioner, educator, presenter, author and, to my mind, a great community leader. Ladies and gentlemen, to introduce herself and some of the great things she's been up to, would you please put your hands together? A great big welcome for Rosemary, if you please.
So, thank you so much, Richard, for the introduction. Thank you for the Healing Centre for inviting me here to present what I refer to sometimes as my story, to show you where I've come from by using loss and grief and in the hope of where I want to go as well. So I would like to acknowledge all contemporary Aboriginal people who have been and still are the custodians of this land and its waters. I would also like to pay my respects to our ancestors and to their contemporary descendants who left Mother Earth far too early. So as Richard introduced me, I cut my teeth on loss and grief, even though back then in the 90s, I didn't have any language for loss and grief. As I was going through my own healing journey in '87 in Sydney, I worked for the CDBR, the Committee to Defend Black Rights, who campaigned for 4 years to call for the Royal Commission into the Aboriginal deaths in custody. Then in '88, went back to Adelaide and then got asked to work on the Royal Commission into the Aboriginal deaths in custody. So in that time, I was seeing, feeling and hearing death and dying, loss and grief, but again, I had no language for it. I could see, feel and hear all this pain, not just locally in Sydney at the time, but around the country as a research officer. So for nearly 30 years, I've been researching and developing loss and grief. And I now know that the body, the human body, is meant to grieve. And that's something that in my research has ceased. And without any shame or blame, we need to understand how we ceased our grieving ceremonies due to 1788. Loss and grief also showed me that it's a human experience. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter whether you're black, white, male, female, young, old. It's a human experience from our cradle to our grave. And I know that our ancestors knew this because they were able to participate, stay connected to their culture and particularly to their grieving ceremonies. And our ancestors was a race of people that was highly evolved spiritually. Many of you may know that our culture, our ancestors, they didn't have infrastructure. They didn't build buildings. They didn't have all of those material trappings. I think our ancestors, our culture, is the keepers of humanity, the keeper of becoming, maintaining a highly evolved spirituality. So a couple of questions came to me from the Healing Foundation. How I came to confront and heal the trauma in '87. So I began my healing in a women's shelter. Phase 1, I ended up in a women's shelter, pretty busted up yet again. From there, I asked the question, how did I end up 4th generation in family violence? I was shown to go back into my past, which was looking at my childhood experiences. So what happened to me as a kid? As Richard referred to it, I became a part of the stolen generation, family violence, all forms of abuses. Then the question from there was, who had the right to take me away from my family after our mother had died? And I had to go back further into my past. And so in phase 3, I had to understand 1788 and why was it so violent. Then I was forced to go back and look at England. What sort of history did they have? Very, very violent history. The inhumanities that they committed to their children, to their young people, sending them down in mines. They die down there. And again, my research, because it's a human experience, I found that I couldn't come from shame or blame. It was about understanding the violence that arrived here in 1788. And so the question was, what sort of people, what made England really, really violent? And then I was forced to go back even further, as in across Europe, and found the Roman Empire were absolutely full of anger, escalating to rage, escalating to violence, escalating to inhumane atrocities. And then the question was, well, what made them really inhumane? And that's when I was thrown back even further, and I found a guy called Plato. Plato is a Greek philosopher who coined the idea in 388 BC, so that's 400 years before that fellow called Jesus was born. He coined the idea that grief is a weakness, therefore the well-educated need not grieve. Now, in my experience, it seems to have come, he spread that across the generations, and then they passed it down the generations. Thereby, there are so many intergenerational experiences, and that is one of them. So intergenerationally, thanks to Plato, the concept that grieving is a weakness came down the generations. And when they stopped grieving out of fear of being labelled, that's when people right across Europe became angry, full of rage, violent and inhumane. And phase 3 and 4 in my model shows that my ancestors lived in harmony. And so I'm thinking, what happened? And when 1788 arrived here, we too had to stop our grieving. So it makes sense to me that down the generations in Indigenous cultures, violence is a part of our contemporary culture. As I said, I come from 4 generations of family violence, and I know that our ancestors weren't a violent race of people. They had conflict, but they weren't violent. They weren't full of rage. They didn't commit inhumane atrocities upon each other. So, how did the stolen generation impact on me was another question. Well, I grew up really, really angry. I grew up really, really... I was a victim of family violence, and I was a perpetrator of it in my own right, because I experienced childhood family violence. Nowhere to go to heal. And so I internalised that and became a perpetrator, an adult perpetrator of family violence. Suicidal thoughts, common. I even had a plan as I was going through this process. Grew up with multiple experiences of racism that stole my sense of intelligence, stole my sense of confidence, self-esteem, my self-worth. When a teacher told me that I was a dummy at 7 years old, when a teacher told me that Aboriginal people were savages, and the little bit of pride that I had in Stolen Generation snapped, and all this shame and anger for my ancestors who I thought and believed hurt those poor white people. That's how I internalised it. So my life experiences and within the Royal Commission had me working with young people, and the most common grief reactions that I found through training with bereavement educational services are these: shock, guilt, grief tears, anger, depression, physical illness, panic and apathy. And those first three, shock, guilt and grief tears, when an individual is experiencing those, my observation is that they're home alone experiencing those. Anger is what can escalate to rage, violence, and for our young people, and I've been in and out of the youth detention centres back home, and every young person that I spoke to, their story was one of abuse, loss and unresolved grief. And when they get to a certain age, I started to observe, 10, 11, 12, that they were saying to the rest of the world, fuck the lot of yous, I'm out of here. And so that suppressed unresolved grief of theirs surfaced like a volcano, and then they take that out into the community, and then just a matter of time before the police are involved, court system, and they end up in juvenile detention centres. So we need to develop grieving ceremonies that are just as much as contemporary as well as finding our way back to our ancestors. So as a griefologist with 30 years' experience, I have a right, a role and a responsibility to ask a very serious question, and without any shame or blame. What if the Western system has been engineered to create and maintain an Indigenous industry centuries before 1788 arrived intergenerationally? What if the Western system is engineered to perpetrate poverty, inequality and injustices, and racism is a byproduct of these? Why would some industries do this? Well, to maintain an Indigenous industry, the multiple systems involved must employ thousands of people across the country. Employment generates income and a lifestyle. And if Indigenous prosperity was achieved, loss of employment and lifestyle is inevitable, for many causing a major grief reaction. To multinationals and to our Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal politicians, academics, policymakers and senior service providers, I ask you to seriously consider, have we become a part of the Indigenous industry, or do I want to be a part of creating Indigenous prosperity? And I'm standing in front of you as an example through lived experience that grieving can create Indigenous prosperity. In my opinion, it can be a preventative model. The word trauma, really interesting to hear the history of that. In my model, I don't use the word trauma because I started to realise that it didn't tell me and it doesn't tell my clients what it is that they're actually experiencing. So when I'm working with our young people, I say to them pretty much, there's nothing wrong with you, you're only grieving. And so together we design, create contemporary grieving processes that is manageable for them and their families. Trauma, the word trauma is like an abstract piece of art. It doesn't make sense, or everybody has to look at that piece of artwork and conclude what it means to them, whereas loss and grief tells us exactly what that piece of artwork is. So thank you so much for listening, and I wish you all the best in your future. Thank you.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you very much, Rosemary, for sharing your journey and your observations and findings on your life. It means so much to all of us. In my journey, I've discovered, with investigating Aboriginal deaths in custody and with all the funerals that we go to and all the grief that we see, I find that grief is love, and that we have a great opportunity to utilise grief, as Rosemary said, as a healing tool. And we manage our trauma in the Aboriginal and Islander communities in such a profound and tremendous way, and quite often we see the negative impact of trauma, but there's a positive as well. The positive is our community ability for resilience, resistance, and how we bounce back from trauma. And I witness quite often great courage, great tenacity and great skill amongst our own. And speaking of which, I get to introduce a young man who I've met in the last little while, and he hasn't borrowed money from me, so I'm very impressed. He's a young Gungandi Yaru man, born and raised on Larrakia country in Darwin. He works as a community legal educator with the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, and he's passionate about empowering Indigenous children and youth. Mark was a member of the Healing Foundation's Young Healers Youth Reference Group, which worked to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma and lateral violence by spreading positive messages about healing and resilience building for young Indigenous people. Ladies and gentlemen, one of our up-and-coming young Indigenous leaders, please put your hands together and give him a warm welcome, if you please. Now, I'm favourite uncle, right? I'm his favourite uncle, I just want you to know that.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Or, yeah. My name is Mark Munnich, and I'm a proud Gungandji and Yaru man, born and raised in Northern Territory. I want to start off with a few acknowledgements. I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we meet on today, the Ngambri and Ngunnawal peoples, and pay respects to elders past, present and future, and to elders who may be in the room today. And I thank Shane Mortimer for his welcome to country. I acknowledge from the bottom of my heart the spirit, strength and the resilience of the members of the stolen generation, their descendants, and the determination of those who are still continuing to find family and their homes. I also acknowledge that today marks the 29th year of the National and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Children's Day, and the theme for this year is We All Belong, My Country, Our Country. And I think it is very important that we all take time out of our days, regardless of how busy we are, to celebrate and acknowledge the achievements of our children and our young people, and to sincerely thank them for the impact that they have on our lives and society. As one of the eldest siblings out of 7 in my family, I start by expressing my gratitude to my brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews for all the things that you've done for me in my life and my journey, and I love yous all. Last of all, I want to thank the Healing and acknowledge the Healing Foundation for inviting me here to speak today on intergenerational trauma as a young person and how we can support our young people. My story with the Healing Foundation began in 2012, where I was given the opportunity to serve on the Healing Foundation's inaugural youth reference group. And on a very personal level, the reasons why I got involved with the Healing Foundation was not only for the great work they did with the members of the stolen generation, it was also a part of me that got involved because both sides of my family were also impacted. And as a young person and being a descendant of the stolen generation, it is very important that we get to know their stories, share their stories, the strengths, and to embed us with the knowledges to pass on to our next generation, and to keep that storyline going. A bit about my family. On my mother's side, the story of my great-grandmother, Clara Lucille Jacamara, Nee Rowe, was taken away from her family and placed in the Beagle Bay Mission in Western Australia. And her book, Proud Heritage, not only tells her story, it emphasises the invaluable pride that I possess about my identity, about being proud of my heritage, and also being about being proud of where I come from and who my mob are. And these values I carry with me for the rest of my life. On my father's side, all 9 of his brothers and sisters were removed from their mother at a very young age and were placed in Retta Dixon Home in Darwin. Although my dad was a baby and didn't know much about what was happening, the stories that my aunties and uncles had told me are stories about their experiences in Retta Dixon are stories that I will always remember, and I believe that there are many more to tell. I was only speaking to my namesake the other day, Mark Munnich Sr., and I want to mention some of the important things that he said to me. Although his experiences on Retta Dixon were terrifying and traumatic, he said that they were good times, but the impact of the trauma blanked out those good times, and it wasn't until the Retta Dixon reunion where all those good times flashed back. He mentioned that because he didn't have a father or a male role model in their lives, or any parents, when he became a parent himself, he found it very difficult as he didn't have those parenting skills to teach or grow his kids up properly. He said to me, and this is something that I'd never knew, that all his brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles had made a vow that against all odds, and no matter how bad things might get with family, the one thing that they would never do is turn their back on their kids, and they'll never let us go through that system. And if it were to be happening, they'll do anything that they can to prevent it. The traits that I learnt from them, there was the strength and resilience they possess. They was able to persevere through very traumatic experiences. They all stuck together, and all those traits that they have passed on to all of us kids, and I see it in all my brothers and sisters and my cousins, because of how close we all are. However, I do personally believe that there is still a lot of healing and unfinished business to do within my family in terms of intergenerational trauma. Sorry. The way that I describe intergenerational trauma is when you drop a stone in the water. It ripples and creates a ripple effect. The impact of that stone hitting the water, although that's where the major impact was caused by that drop, it doesn't stop then and there. And it can be passed on to generations after generations, and that's where the cycle occurs, which could create more problems for families and communities if something isn't done about the effects. The effects of intergenerational trauma can have serious impacts on families, communities, and particularly on our children and young people. Throughout my life, my experiences in my community, the places I've worked, the way that I've seen young people deal and cope with traumatic experiences and conflict is by consuming alcohol, using drugs, ice, ganja, sniffing, chroming, violent approaches to situations, becoming involved with the criminal justice system, the recidivism that occurs, going in and out of jail, the long-term mental health issues, suicide, and as our young people get older, the experiences that I mention and the way that they see others cope with it will be all they know if we don't address the root of the problem. And I think that resilience building and empowering our young people is paramount to addressing intergenerational trauma. I'm sure that everyone is aware of that Don Dale incident, and I really don't want to use this time to criticise what had occurred, but I want to take this time to reflect on the situation. I felt horror and pain for those young men, and being in Darwin, and for this to be occurring in our own backyard, and to see the way that they were treated while being incarcerated shocked me to say the least. And the despair that the family members of those young men must feel by witnessing this happen to their own children would no doubt be just as painful and traumatic for them for a long, long time. Juvenile detention should be used as a platform to rehabilitate our young people, not to be used as a platform to vilify, dehumanise and traumatise the physical, mental and spiritual well-being of our young people to the point where they become more vulnerable than what they were going in and causing more harm than good. Quite often people are too quick to write people off and label them as bad kids, liability to society, or beyond redemption once they become incarcerated. There are better avenues and solutions to locking our young people up and taking them away from families. There should be preventative healing programs in place with solutions developed in collaboration with Indigenous peoples young people particularly, and communities by providing holistic support approaches to struggling families, as they are probably just as impacted just as much as those young people. In 2012, Olga Haviland, the former Coordinator General of the Remote Services in the Northern Territory, and who is now the CEO of Dillon Dilbert Health Service, mentioned in one of her reports as the Coordinator General, and I quote, "Today, tens of millions of dollars are spent on separating children and families, while very little is invested in supporting families to raise healthy children under the very challenging circumstances over which they have little control." And just following that, and I quote, "Government commits hundreds of millions of dollars to policing incarceration while providing minimal support for youth programs and the absence of support programs for Aboriginal men, and serious gaps in the investments of the early years of life. And while this continues, ever-increasing numbers of Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal people will continue to be deployed into Aboriginal communities to deliver services, creating limited opportunities to be actively engaged in decisions that directly affect their lives." In analysis of those things she mentioned, are important things as to what healing and preventative programs need to be designed on. And on the basis of what she mentioned, emphasise the following elements of those programs need to be taken into account. They need to be community controlled. They need to be involving local Indigenous people from the relevant communities or the clan groups. The need for cultural appropriateness, adequately funded and properly resourced. The need to have focus on our children and our youth. Although they should be preventative programs, it is important that they are proactive, not reactive. And the need for specific programs such as men and women's programs. And as again, all those mentioned should be the guiding principles and taken into account when designing and developing programs to ensure that it's done in a culturally safe way and input from the relevant mob. In 2013, as part of the Healing Foundation's Youth Reference Group, we conducted a national Young Healers survey to get a view of what the issues were of young people, what healing meant for them, and the impacts of stolen generation. The results that came back were 27% of young people surveyed were 15 years old, approximately 60% were Aboriginal, 28% were Torres Strait Islander, 60% could identify members of their family being part of the stolen generations, and the same amount felt that stolen generation policies still impact their lives today. And those impacts that they mentioned are impact on culture, family connections, and a loss of identity. To see these responses from the national youth community and how the stolen generation era has impacted on them clearly shows the intergenerational trauma and the ripple effects in action. And those impacts, particularly those three elements, the impact on culture, family connections, and loss of identity, are crucial to our well-being and who we are. And I say this personally, if I were to be without any of those, my family, my culture, and my identity, I would be nothing, and I wouldn't be here today. We as Aboriginal peoples all have a part to play here. It is in these very important movements, breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma, empowering our young people and children by ensuring that they get the best start in life, and by being part of the implementation of the cultural healing programs in our communities. Thank you all for listening.
Well done, Mark. Thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce another of our panel members, who's a proud Wiradjuri Koori woman with connections to southwestern New South Wales and South Australia. She is an academic leader and a recognised expert in public health, a prominent advocate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and education, and is the University of Sydney's inaugural Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Engagement and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership. She also leads the university's work in this area. She's trained as a nurse before entering medical school, has additional qualifications and experience in epidemiology, which I'm not sure what it is, but it sounds very, very flash. And public health, it is flash, is that right? It could, and is the first recorded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person to receive a PhD in medicine from the University of Sydney. Now get this, she's also a group captain, which is the equivalent of a colonel, a group captain as a specialist reservist in the Australian Air Force. Ladies and gentlemen, a friend of mine for many years now, or several years now, Professor Jackson Pulver, Lisa Jackson Pulver, if you put your hands together.
Oh, thank God you didn't say what I thought you were going to say. Oh, I'm so grateful. So, the alluvial peoples of this land, I pay my deepest respects to you and thank you so much for that incredibly joyous and truly inspiring welcome to us all. I pay my respects to your people, to your communities, to your families, and recognise that many Wiradjuri share very deep links with your people as well. I'd also like to pay my respects to all of those who are here today, to your families, to your countries, to your peoples, to your spirit. And thank you all so very, very much for being here with us to share this discussion today. I'd like to thank the Healing Foundation. It's a pretty awesome opportunity to be working with you fellas. You're an amazing group of people and you're changing lives on a daily basis. And you're not just changing lives for today, but you're changing the lives of all of those who are to come for generations to come. It's really critical work, so thank you. I remember the day Mr Rudd apologised on behalf of the Parliament of this country. It was a long time coming. I can remember we were fighting for a long time to have the governments acknowledge what happened here today. We'd gone through a bitter history wars. The remnants still exist today. But the day before Mr Rudd's apology and that of Dr Nelson and others, the day before that happened was a welcome to country. And I can remember it very, very well because it was the first time that people, the Parliament of this country on behalf of all Australians, was welcomed to this place. And that on further discussions with many of the elders that were there today, I learnt something very, very important, and that is that that welcome to country had happened for all of the generations that are here today, all of the generations that had been before, all of those, no matter whether they came on a boat in 1788 or before, or whether they came on an aircraft, whether they lay their hand here at night, their head here at night, and call this place home for however short or long a time, that there is a welcome to country. And with that welcome to country for all of those people comes rights and responsibilities. And what we're talking today about in this wonderful day of celebrating our children is that we all, no matter who we are, have a responsibility, we have rights and we have obligations to make sure that things are going well. There's a lot that's been said about our youth, about our children, and there's a growing and very clearly evidence-based libraries full of what it is that causes intergenerational trauma and how it can be addressed. Communities have been approached, elders have been spoken to, juveniles have been interviewed, researchers have been engaged, people have been empowered to go forth and find that magic thing that is the cure to intergenerational trauma. As though a piece of research or a project or a printed document would be what was needed to deal with this issue. And I can't tell you how many beautiful books I've got on my library shelves, just like everyone else does, that are worthy, full, complete, heavily researched, based in the literature, sharing the stories of people, heartbreaking as they do, where the recommendations have been duly dismissed because people better than us have made a decision that it's all just too jolly hard. And that is a real shame, because a lot of those voices have gone back to country, gone back to spirit, and there's a new generation of people coming along, and the trauma recontinues and the stories continue, and we still have a ways to go. The principles and practice of what we need to do are not rocket science. We already know what they are. The real magic, I think, comes in how do we make it so? How do we grip up what we need to do as a nation and as all peoples who belong and as all peoples who've got rights and responsibilities and obligations to make this right? What do we need to do as individuals in that march, that forward practice, that one step after the other to make a change? The Dondale Centre is front and foremost of our minds at the moment because of the horror. But we know that centres like that exist all over our nation and have done for a long, long time. And the worst part of this is that we've all known the stories. You hear the stories, right? But it's only when it reaches the telly and people turn it on and see it that all of a sudden there's the evidence. There's the proof. So why is it the stories of individuals who are brave enough to stand up and say, this is what's been happening here for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 200, 230 years? Why is that diminished? Why are those voices not privileged? Why are those stories not privileged? Why are they not shared? And why don't we have a royal commission that happened a long, long time ago that will come out with recommendations that were taken on board? Can you imagine what the story would be today if that occurred at the first time this kind of violence and trauma came to our place? Can you imagine what this nation would look like? How strong it would be? How powerful it would be? What would be the languages that we would speak? What would be the kinship systems that people would know? What would be our skin relationships to each other and country? We'd have a little bit more. We'd have a lot more in this wonderful nation that we call Australia, if that had happened a long time ago. We do need change, and again, this is documented in many essays and books, and it needs to be led by the people, by our communities, by our organisations, and by those who have got the strength of community and that voice. In my opinion, education is truly a key here, and it's not only education of our beautiful young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women, but it's also about the education piece that all Australians need to embrace and to enjoy and to learn from and to grow on, because the 60,000-year history is such a long history for us to understand and know and own and embrace and rejoice in. Australia is not a history of 230 years, and it's a little bit hard when we look at celebrating Australia and it's only that very, very small, narrow time frame, which is tiny when you think of how long ago the beginning of time was, which is when my grandmothers say we've been here since. Anywhere between a third and a quarter of all of our young people experience or have experienced homelessness. We know that many of those young people have also experienced life in juvenile detention, or they've gone through the juvenile justice system, and I use that word advisedly. And we know that many of those young people are suffering from intergenerational trauma and grief. Some call it mental health issues, but they're suffering from that. And it's very hard to grip up the importance of trauma-informed, holistic and culturally appropriate responses. But it was mentioned before that connection to country, to our soil, to our air, to our waters is so vitally important. People need to know where they come from and they need to know where they belong. And unfortunately, there are many today who don't know where they come from. But by Joe, everyone here does belong. And that's the story that we need to start sharing. I was recently at a graduation ceremony witnessing a number of strong Aboriginal people becoming doctors and becoming qualified in public health. And and this is when I was at the University of New South Wales very recently, and the elder in residence for medicine is a lady called Auntie Ali Golding. And Auntie Ali's term is coming to an end now, and they're going through a process, I believe, to appoint some new elders. But Auntie Ali did a short acknowledgement of country. See, she's a Biripi woman, she doesn't come from that land. So she acknowledged country and shared a little story of herself to the 1,000 people or so that were sitting in the graduation hall. And the Chancellor acknowledged Aunt, and all the Aboriginal people acknowledged Aunt. And then something quite amazing happened. This very beautiful African man stood up and he put a cape on, a special cape over his graduation gowns, and he got onto stage, and the Chancellor reached out to shake his hand, as they do, and this African man fell to his knees and then onto his hands in front of Auntie Ali. And he performed a very small ceremony of clapping, a special clap that his people do when they're in the presence of a great elder to honour. And it was only then did that gentleman then stand up and greet the Chancellor. To this man from another continent, from another place, who was there for such a short period of time to get a degree that he can take back home and serve his people, he saw the importance of how we serve our people. Now, wouldn't that be amazing if the knowledge of how to pay respects to our elders, our traditional owners and our knowledge custodians was shared by all Australians? Can you imagine what strength there would be with us today? I've been asked to talk a little bit about how to transform policy and practice. I've been asked to share some of the work that we've been doing over the years with intergenerational grief, with trauma, with our work with stolen generations, which is always, of course, as we've learnt from our previous speakers, is always informed by family and by our own community context. But I will just talk about 6 different principles. The first is that intergenerational trauma has to occur with and between generations. It's not just one generation that's traumatised. People that are a long way away from their grandparents and their great-grandparents and others who are traumatised are still suffering today as though the trauma had happened to them. Why? Because their connection to country, their connection to family, their connection to the story, their connection to culture, their connection to language and to stories and to practice is changed because of that one event, and that hurts people. We need to use our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations effectively to work out ways of brokering these solutions. We need to empower them by funding them properly and resourcing them properly and making sure it's their voices that are privileged in the debate at government level and at all levels, in the hospital system, in the education system, at all times, so that that's the voice that's privileged. Support those organisations by putting other like-minded, although not necessarily Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations around them. We need our hospital systems, we need our justice systems, we need our social systems to be supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations to deliver on the work. Look at co-creation as an honest and responsible way of responding to this. Like, as I said before, all of those reports that are collecting dust on our library shelves have been co-created with a lot of effort and a lot of goodwill, only to have that effort and goodwill changed. But if we honestly embraced co-creation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as knowledge holders in this work, then I believe that we will reduce fragmentation, we'll be able to engage all the organisations in the community and develop responses and a local responsibility mechanism that will allow us to succeed. Now, this might seem like an impossible thing to do. Just because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean it can't be done now. Or just because we've had elements of it before, very, very localised, doesn't mean we can say, here's a best practice model, let's apply it across the sector. Just because it's hard doesn't make it impossible. It's just hard, but we can do it. Create safe environments by building and focusing on successes, empowering that stuff that works, accentuate the positive, recognising the metrics, recognising the success stories, looking at what the critical success factors are for stuff that works. Like many here, I've seen excellent community-controlled programs develop out of community, run by community, developed for the need of that community, funded for 12 months? Oh, no. Let's be generous. Let's say 3 years. And then what happens? All that local knowledge has been built up, all that energy has been built up, all that goodwill's been built up. Funding's finished. We're going to change horses midstream. We're going to get another mob in, without that kind of history, and we'll get someone else to do it. It's almost as though an earwig gets put into someone's ear and, oh, this is a better idea. Give it to my consultancy company. And we see this all the time. And then we lose capability and capacity in community because those health workers and other skilled people have now lost their jobs. They go onto the cycle of unemployment. People become heartbroken. Community says to them, why didn't you fellas finish that work? You know, and it becomes just that cycle of upset. We can look at these things in a different way. We can start to allow healing teams and other groups to really embrace what holism is and work in community with all of those stakeholders so that we can look at a holistic practice and we can lend ourselves to best practice models, because at the end of the day, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people really do know about this stuff, you know. We've survived here for 60,000 years. There is something there that we've been doing right for a very, 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 very long time. And we're still here. We're surviving. And the best thing is that our numbers are growing. And in the census next week, every Aboriginal person in the land will be asked to fill in the census, and I truly hope they do. And I truly hope they identify themselves, because I suspect we're going to have a lot more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people identifying next week in the census, and those numbers will be growing, and that will allow us then to make some better decisions about how we fund. That will give us a stronger voice, because we are powerful by numbers, we are powerful by groups. And we need to grip that up and brace that up. We've got lots and lots of models that have been documented, and the Healing Foundation is soon to start a clearinghouse or a website where all of those wonderful models of practice can be. You know, I would support everybody to go and log onto that website and start utilising those models, those stories, those research projects as the best practice model for your organisation, no matter whether you're in the large health departments, the large Commonwealth organisations, community-controlled organisations, church organisations, it doesn't matter. There's stuff there that you'll be able to use. We need to recognise, as Rosemary reminds us, that everybody and our spirits are built for grieving, and to stop that process does make us sick. The evidence is there. You know, I'm an epidemiologist, I can cite all that stuff off for you, but I suspect this audience knows all the metrics, so I won't labour that point. But we have to listen to the stories, we have to own those stories, and we have to recognise that being part of the solution is a very courageous stand to make, and it can be a little bit difficult because we are embedded in a deficit model. We just have to stop that. We have to achieve the strengths that this notion is known for. And as I said before, can you imagine what it would have been like if someone paid attention to what we were saying 220 years ago? I know that my time is almost up. I'm being looked at very kindly by my friend Richard, but he will let me read this poem out to you. A few years ago, Mura Murray was asked to create a resource for collective healing, or participate in creating a resource for collective healing for members of the stolen generations. And the report was headed up by a beautiful poem. And I know many of you would know this. The poem was called Didiri, and it was written by an absolutely amazing woman. And I'll just read it to you. A special quality, a unique gift of the Aboriginal people, is inner, deep listening and quiet, still awareness. Didiri recognises the deep spring that is inside us. It is something like what you call contemplation. The contemplative way of Didiri spreads over our whole life. It renews us and brings us peace. It makes us feel whole again. In our Aboriginal way, we learnt to listen from our earliest times. We could not live good and useful lives unless we listened. We're not threatened by silence. We're completely at home in it. Our Aboriginal way has taught us to be still and to wait. We do not try to hurry things up. We let them follow their natural course, just like the seasons. We watch the moon in each of its phases. We wait for the rain to fill our waters and river and thirsty earth. When twilight comes, we prepare for the night. At dawn, we rise with the sun. We watch the bush foods and wait for them to open before we gather them. We wait for our young people as they grow, stage by stage through their initiation ceremonies. When a relation dies, we wait for a long time with the sorrow. We own our grief and allow it to heal slowly. We wait for the right time for our ceremonies and meetings. The right people must be present. Careful preparations must be made. We don't mind waiting because we want things to be done with care. Sometimes many hours must be spent painting the body before an important ceremony. We don't worry. We know that in time and in the spirit of Didiri, that deep listening and quiet stillness, the way will be made clear. We are like the tree standing in the middle of a bushfire sweeping through the timber. The leaves are scorched and the tough bark is scarred and burnt, but inside the tree, the sap is still flowing, and under the ground, the roots are still strong. Like that tree, we've endured the flames and we still have the power to be reborn. Our people are used to the struggle and the long waiting. We still wait for the white people to understand us better. We ourselves have spent many years learning about the white man's ways. We've learned to speak the white man's language. We've listened to what he had to say. This learning and listening should go both ways. We would like people to take time to listen to us. We're hoping the people will come closer. We keep longing for the things that we've always hoped for: respect and understanding. We know that our white brothers and sisters carry their own particular burdens. We believe that if they let us come to them, open their minds, and to us, we may lighten their burdens. There is a struggle for us, but we've not lost our spirit of Diriri. There are deep springs within each of us. Within this deep spring, which is very much the spirit, is a sound, the sound of deep calling to deep. The time for rebirth is now. If our culture is alive and strong and respected, it will grow. It will not die, and our spirit will not die. I believe the spirit of Diriri is what we have to offer. It will blossom and grow, not just within ourselves, but within us all. As previously mentioned, belonging and the topic of today's talk is everyone's business. This work is not just about being sensible approaches for Aboriginal communities. Quite frankly, it's sensible for us all. Thank you for your time.
And thank you. And thank you very much, Lisa. I'm Richard Frankland. We're doing Our Future, Our Way, talking intergenerational trauma webinar all around the country, right from Yaru country, Larrakia country, right down to Palwa and every tribe in between. And right now we're going to be taking questions both from our live audience here in Canberra and also from our webinar audience around the country. So I'd like to kick off. Anyone got a question here, or would you like... I'm seeing a couple of hands up. Any others? Okay, I'm going to kick it off here. I've got a question for our esteemed panel members. Can you tell me, Rosemary, you spoke about grief, our bodies needing to grieve. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that for us?
So, from personal experiences and reading documents, reading on books about Aboriginal traditional ways of grieving, I see the body as a vessel, as a container, and grief energy is live energy. It's like electricity. It's live energy. And so when we go into a state of grief, as in grief anger, say for example, if we don't have a safe place to go and grieve, use the body to express it, then the grief anger stays trapped in the physical body, and over time that's where it can escalate to rage and then to violence. And so when violence comes into an individual's life, that to me is, the body is like a pressure cooker and it just explodes.
So when we talk lateral violence, which is when you're when a community or a minority group are on the bottom rung of the ladder, and the rage, fear, terror, anger makes you not punch upwards, but you strike out against those around you. Is that a form of grief as well, Mark? Would you see that as a form of grief, lateral violence?
Yeah, and I think because, also with oppression as well, I think lateral violence has a lot to play with, with grieving, people that are grieving themselves, and then they pass that grief on to others. Mm.
And Mark, do you see a lot of lateral violence amongst our young people?
Yeah, even some of our children as well. Even though they don't know it, that they're saying you reckon yourself, or you think you're good. A lot of those things that I see, but they don't know it themselves. Even young children is quite young.
And is that coming from trauma, and is it creating more trauma?
I think, it's coming from trauma and a bit of both, actually. It's coming from traumatic experiences that they face, because the families of, these young people where they come from are people that are struggling as well.
I don't want to concentrate too much on the Four Corners show that came up and showed that horrific violence that was happening, that horrible trauma. But the young people that I've spoken to since that happened are clearly traumatised. I've had quite a few young people, ring me up or drop on my doorstep at work or at home and bring up the trauma just from witnessing that and saying that this has happened to them in some way, shape or form. Is it a common occurrence, that type of trauma coming out like that?
Yeah, and even I think like the trauma, that they faced it, whilst being incarcerated, and like also from other young people witnessing that, like myself personally, like witnessing it I'm quite traumatised a bit about it, and I just and as I mentioned, like as I spoke earlier, like imagine the families, they had no direct impact with it, but just by witnessing it, that was their children that was happening to,
And Lisa, you navigate many systems. You navigate a university system. You research extensively. You've done a lot of work in cultural safety. How can we make our young people create culturally safe frameworks, culturally safe pathways in institutions like that? If the pendulum swung so far that the jailers feel that it's okay to perpetrate that type of violence, how do we retrieve that? How do we come back to some type of normal relationship?
We need to look at things holistically and treat the system as a whole entity. Just targeting young people alone, as much as our youth require support and love and assistance and their voices to be privileged, so that when they do come home from these environments, and I'll just do a quick bypass here, one of the big things about that footage, a colleague came to me and said, I'm so upset because one of my sister's kids told me that happened to them a while ago and I dismissed it. Right? So we just have to remember that trauma is really starting to make people feel very, very bad because they heard the story and they did nothing with it. So we have to be clear about that. But coming back to your question, treating the system as a whole, recognising that we as an Aboriginal society, if you like, are not a standalone feature of the Australian society. We are very much inculcated in that society. We belong here, we're very a part of society, and I think we need to embrace that, and we need to bring on board our allies, our colleagues, our friends, and do that education piece with them and bring them into the camp with us, because they're very much a part of the solution. And non-Aboriginal allies have to be empowered, and they have to learn how to listen, and they have to learn how to belong, and they have to learn how to pay respect and to privilege the Aboriginal voices, because they're the ones who really do have the insight in what needs to get done. And what needs to get done is not so much about what all the clever people have been writing in the documents. It's very much about listening carefully to what community needs, and it will be, I suspect, quite different from what our organisations and our government bodies have been doing in the past. So they need to start thinking outside of the box, because they've been throwing a lot of money at a lot of stuff for a long time and not much has been happening. So I think we need to make them a little bit more accountable and say, OK, your practice is wrong, government. We need to think and revise this and start doing things in the way that we need it done to make sure that we get the changes that we need for our families and communities.
Thank you very much. Well said. That's tremendous. So we're taking questions from the audience, and we've got a question over here. Just use the microphone and let me know who you are, so that I'm not talking to an anonymous person.
Well, I love being anonymous. I want to address the question to Lisa. I'm Gary Lilienthal. Do you remember me?
Oh, hello.
How are you?
I thought you were
Lovely to
living
see
in
you.
Malaysia. There you go.
I want to reframe what you said, Lisa. I published a paper last year in the Commonwealth Law Bulletin on the nature of torture. And I was able to divide torture into two kinds. The second kind was the kind of torture performed by governments specifically to control sectors of the population. And the research showed that even type 1 torture, the type of torture supposedly to get information out of professional soldiers who don't give information under torture, had the same effect. As soon as you publicise it, you control the population. With that in mind, And keeping in mind it was published by the Commonwealth Law Bulletin, the Law Bulletin of the Commonwealth of Nations. Isn't it so that when our beautiful children are tortured and we hear about it through hearsay and rumour and grapevine, we just accept it and we do nothing? But when it's put on a government organ, such as the ABC, suddenly there's some traumatic response that affects us all rhetorically because it's coming from the government organ. Haven't they just exposed that torture as a method of control? And if the answer to that question is yes, and this is the question I'd like you to consider, is the answer yes? But if the answer is yes, isn't that why they're throwing so much money at it?
Lisa, what have you got to say there? Is it yes? And
that's a huge question, and
huge
I don't think it's as easy as saying yes or no, because I don't understand the law instrument as well as Gary does. Obviously, he's published in this world. But what I can say is that, and correct you, that when people have said this stuff has happened in the past, in the absence of the proof, right, there are people that do believe it. You know, out of our Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody, there was this official visitors program that started as a way of ensuring that people were able to report breaches and to report things like this. So there was it was a mechanism that was there. I'm not making a judgment as to whether it was effective or whether it was big enough, but there was a mechanism. People in communities know that this has been happening. You know, mothers and fathers and guardians and friends have known this has been happening, but it's only when the broader Australian community sees this and says, oh, that must be true because it's on TV, that's what I have a problem with, right? That's what I have a problem with. So I can't really answer the question that you've posed. What I can say, though, is that it's a real shame that we do not privilege the voices of the most vulnerable in this discussion, in this debate, to allow what they say to be the truth, to be a truth, and instead putting if there is an investigation or a report to be done, taking the other voices as the ones that must be true.
thank you very much. Now we have a web question, so we'll go to the web and we'll have a bit of an. It's up on the screen, but I'll read it out. The stolen generation is not in the past. Right now, 5 times the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are being removed from their families as when bringing them home was written. How can we heal from trauma when the mass removal of our children still goes on? And that's written a statement question from Vanessa. Who'd like to have a crack at that? Rosemary, would you like to?
So this is where it's really valuable for children and their families, and even supportive adults, to help that child go through a grieving process. Healing, to be able to maintain a sense of themselves, that there's nothing wrong with them. They are only grieving, they've been removed from their family. If they've been removed from their family for good reason, how can the family and the child, where possible, stay connected over a period of time, so that the child doesn't grow up and misinterpret why they've been removed, which a lot of my clients believe that they've done something wrong. Their self-worth is really unstable by the time they become teenagers and adults, and that's where the major grief reaction comes in when they're kids, teenagers.
Thank you, Rosemary. So, Mark, I see a lot of poverty of spirit out there amongst our young people. People disengaging from our culture, disengaging from our services, disengaging from their heritage in almost every respect sometimes. What type of approach should we be taking to that poverty of spirit?
I think a holistic, like as mentioned, holistic approach to those situations. And like the question posed by Vanessa, I completely agree. You know, it's stolen, even though it's not the stolen generation, it's still happening. A lot of our children being taken away from their families when they should be with family. You know, it's about empowering the parent, you know, as I said, taking the holistic approach and empowering parents, empowering the children all at once, because I think if you focus on one thing, which is good, like giving that intense support, but, you know, it's the parents that seem to miss out, and that's where they're struggling because, you know, people, as I said, my uncle, he didn't have that parenting skills. You know, it might be some things like that. But I mean, like, it's, yeah, the holistic approach to, you know, empowering our young people and our children.
And there's a distinct lack of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander foster parents. If you've got space in your heart, if you've got space in your home, open it up for these kids. Get them in contact with their culture, get them in contact with their families. You're the key. You're the access point to the wealth and power of our culture, whether you know it or not. Now, we've got a bit of a video question coming up. Let's check it out.
Hi, my name's Jasmine Onus and I'm a Bindal and Gunditjmara woman currently residing on Larrakia country in Darwin. I am a descendant of 4 generations of family members who were forcibly removed as part of the stolen generation. So I have the lived experience of the impacts of institutionalisation of my family members. With the exposure of the abuse and maltreatment of our young people in detention centres in the Territory and indeed across Australia, it's evident that this next wave of institutionalisation is not working. So my question to the panel is, what are some solutions and how can states and territories move away from this model of systemic racism and institutionalisation of our young people to a model that draws upon the strength of our communities and families and works with our young people to rehabilitate them and strengthen them?
Tremendous question from a Gunditjmara woman. I'm Gunditjmara. We're all beautiful, as you can see. Lisa, can you kick off? We'll keep the answers brief because we don't have much time to go.
Yeah, for sure. Look, the stolen generation is not something in history. It's still happening today, and it's going to keep on happening until we start looking at the effect of what's going on as more, and forgive me, I'm a health professional, this is a symptom of a bigger problem or of a bigger disease. And unless we do go behind the why, and Rosemary gave us a beautiful story before of going back, all the way back, until we get to that causal mechanism and treat it, listen to it, learn it, own it, understand it, we're still going to keep getting all of these millions of issues out there which are not easily solved. We need to go back, start looking at this as a symptom. What is the effect?
Thank you very much. Now, we're talking intergenerational trauma. It's a webinar. We're going all over the country. Any questions from the audience here at the moment? A very shy audience we've got, which isn't normally like a Canberra audience. Oh, here we go, a young lady in the middle there. Don't forget to tell me your name, and if you owe me money, please pay up now.
Hi, my name's Leanne. I'm a Wiradjuri woman. And
troublemakers, you Wiradjuri.
We try. I work in government, but I'm also a mum. And Rosemary, you were talking about grieving ceremonies, and a lot of our culture has been lost. So what can we do as parents to identify grief in our kids? And what are some of the tools that we can have as parents to help them through that?
So, having 10 minutes, I wasn't able to explain what grief emotions are, but it's about teaching parents, families, what are the grief emotions. So I've talked about grief anger. We're allowed to get angry. It's a part of being a human being. For children, intuitively, you can tell when a child is angry. In traditional Aboriginal cultures, a child was allowed to really express their grief anger at whatever was happening. So it's about creating a safe place for your child to express. And, you know, again, I haven't got time to go through each grief emotion, but if grief emotions were on the fridge, grief sadness, grief anger, two very dominant grief emotions that a child could experience, and you can see that a child is angry. Ask the child, how are you feeling, honey? And get them to point to the fridge so that they can tell you how they're feeling, and then, you know, intuitively help them talk it through. What's happened at school? Did something happen? But it'd be, you know, I've got training programs, and before I leave this earth, I'd love to be able to train communities, families, service providers on what is loss and grief. Otherwise, the grief, anger and the rage will still become intergenerational.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. Now, we've got a web question, so it's over to the web, and the question reads, considering the number of Royal Commissions we've had in the past, bringing them home, Black Death, now Dondale, with little implementation of recommendations, how can we now look to implement these recommendations, change the policy landscape and build new and real relationships for the betterment of our people? And that's from Mikey. Who'd like to... Mark, I think it's about your turn. How are you going there? You're having another read, are you?
Yeah.
Is there hope, I think, is the crux of it, isn't it?
Well, with the Royal Commission that was originally proposed, and one of the previous judges, Brian Ross, was going to be that heads it up. And I think there was a lot of, backlash from the community about that, particularly back home. I think now that implementing those recommendations is also that we've got someone like Mick Gooder and a woman up there as well. So I think that, make sure that the gender balance, and also that there's an Aboriginal person heading it up. I think a lot of the time, like when you look at implementing these recommendations, is there's things that they need to do before that, like before actually making recommendations. They need to get recommendations from young people, who were victims and who were survivors of that within the detention centres, and to be, done by the young people. And, I think we was only just talking about it this morning, like once the recommendations are set, it's what happens to that report, after. And I think it's something, things that should be done after that.
So it'll take all of us to get these recommendations from the Royal Commission, if we agree with them. It'll take all of us to get together as a people, to unite and to fight really hard to make sure they're implemented. We've got to wrap it up now. What I'd like to do is just grab a quick 30 seconds from each person to just a summary on where you think we should go. How much hope is there?
Recognise that we've done a lot of this before. As the last question showed us, we've had many, many Royal Commissions, and we've had lots and lots of reports, think bringing little children are sacred. There's lots and lots of them we could name. We've got hosts and hosts and hosts of recommendations. Let's start empowering those recommendations and making them happen. Hold them to account. There's a reason why the recommendations are written in these by our people. There's a lot of words, a lot of grief, a lot of energy in there. Let's brush them off, review them and bring them to now and make it happen.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Yeah, definitely accountability and empowerment for young people as well. And, as I said, with accountability is making those people who, enforcing these recommendations and from that Royal Commission accountable. Because I think that's, we don't want to let our mob down again, because we've been let down too much times. And that's what I mean, we need to see action from this.
Thank you very much. And Rosemary?
So we can't heal as a nation, we can't heal as a people, we can't heal as a community, as a family, until first the individual has a process that they can go through to be able to become empowered. That's how we become empowered as a nation. And nation as an Aboriginal people, as well as an Australian nation. And loss and grief seems to be a model that has shown itself as being at least a process. And in relation to the Aboriginal Deaths in Custody Royal Commission, those 300-odd recommendations, we as Aboriginal people have to take a responsibility for standing up and moving those recommendations forward as well. I think what happened, what I was able to observe, is that we as Aboriginal people back then maybe sat on our laurels and thought maybe the government has a responsibility to now implement those. Well, it's about a two-pronged approach here. If we as Aboriginal people don't, and our supporters don't push this next Royal Commission, that's the only reason those recommendations are going to sit on a shelf. We have to be active and fight for those recommendation to be implemented as well, not just government.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our wonderful panel. And say hello to your family and friends around the country as well. Could you please also thank Shane for that wonderful welcome to country? And what a tremendous job Richard and the team at the Healing Foundation have done for all of us. So give them a big round of applause. I'm Richard Frankland. I'd like to say thank you to all of you for being here, and for those that asked questions, you're absolutely tremendous. Those of you that were scared, I'm going to get you later. And those of you that owe me money, I'll meet you at the door. So thank you very much, and see you next time on Our Future, Our Way. Cheers.